Hello, this is the online remote replacement for your lecture on parenting and life history theory. So this is a bit of the culmination of all the stuff we've seen in terms of attractiveness, reproduction, and sort of the dynamics of reproduction, given the criteria on both sides. So now we have to look at what's usually the consequence of reproductive activities, obviously, which is parenting in humans. So I will sort of explain many of these things, but you'll have to compare your notes on this to your notes on the readings to be sure that you actually sort of follow all these points, some of which have to do with the sort of dynamics of various situations and how they interact. So that may be sometimes a bit more complicated than the slides would suggest. In any case, let us start, and we can start by talking about parenting. So you remember I used this slide several times to say that because of the evolutionary sort of changes that happen over the last sort of, say, million years or more in humans, in hominids and humans, what you get is a sort of end result, which is a division of labor that creates stable pairs, stable reproductive pairs that are sort of that last for a long time after courtship and mating. The interesting thing about those pairs is that I mean, not just that they're open-ended, they go for a long time usually, they don't have a clear sort of end point, but also they're multi-purpose, which is something that's pretty rare among primate species. So there's sexual access and sexual exclusivity, as we saw, that's a pretty important thing. There's resource sharing, and there's parenting. And the sexual division of labor sort of implies that sort of most of large prey hunting with uncertainty, danger, and mobility is done by males, and most of extraction and collecting, or quite a lot of it, is done at short range from encampments and sort of shelters where people live, is done by females. So that's something that seems to be universal in foraging societies, but also there's all sorts of evidence from archaeology to suggest that that's the division of labor. Now, that means that there's shared resources within this sort of stable pair, but also that there's very large paternal investment. And this division of labor and its consequences are well known and lead to all sorts of benefits and costs of parenting in human evolution. So, you know, we've said many, many times that whenever you look at adaptations, you must not just look at their benefits in terms of fitness increases, but also at their costs. So parenting is, of course, beneficial to the extent that it increases fitness by increasing the viability of offspring and their own sort of reproductive capacities. But it's also something that comes at a cost. So if you look at mothering, so, you know, just looking after offspring from the point of view of mothers, of course, there seems to be a higher fitness in looking after offspring and enhancing their own fitness. Because of included fitness, enhancing the fitness of your offspring is your own fitness. But there is also costs, and for example, you know, we talked about direct costs in the sense that, you know, you have energy expense, you have lots of things like that, but also you have opportunity costs in the sense that, you know, for example, any resources that are diverted, that are sort of invested in one offspring is not invested in other offspring, and also is not invested in preparing yourself for having more offspring in the future. That is to say, to the extent that future offspring figure as a potential contributor to your fitness, there's a cost in, you know, investing in present offspring. So we would predict that these behaviors that we know about, mothers' attitudes to their infants, and protection of their infants, and so on, would shift if there is too high cost. Now, in lots of traditional psychology of these things, people used to think that, well, a mother and infant, or especially during gestation, are the best example of complete cooperation and collaboration between the two organisms, because their interests are identical. But actually, if you think of it in genetic terms, you realize that their interests overlap to a large degree, but they're not identical, in the sense that, first of all, that a fetus and then an infant carries not just his mother's genes, but also his father's genes, and they may have different sort of interests. But also, even during gestation, the interests of the mother and the interests of the fetus are not totally identical, in the sense that, from the point of view of the fetus's fitness, the more resources spent on making that fetus grow and be viable and fight against infections or whatever, all these things, the better. However, from the mother's point of view, the mother, first of all, may already have some offspring, and investing all her body resources into this new offspring means less for the existing offspring. But also, this woman has a future, and that future has a reproductive horizon that may be some years in the future, which means that if you, for example, if your organism damages its bodies by wear and tear during one pregnancy, you make future pregnancies less likely, but also probably less high quality for the fetus. So you have to a sort of balance of cost and benefit that has to be maintained. And the same goes for fathers and infants, in the sense that, as we say here, parental investment increases fitness, but only to the extent that there is paternal certainty. So we've talked about that several times, but you would expect parenting among human fathers to be very, very strongly correlated to paternal certainty. It certainly is the case in lots of other species where fathers contribute. There are lots of bird species where fathers contribute. That, again, paternal certainty, in the sense of mate guarding, for example, is a huge contributor to paternal contribution. So parenting manifests itself in humans in lots of ways, lots of behaviors, but also in lots of mental states. And first of all, in obviously the sort of parental sort of sentiments, like the warm glow of parenthood, this sort of universally observed sort of feeling of great sort of interest, devotion, and emotional interest in infants, and also a motivation for self-sacrifice in the interests of infants. And there are sexual differences in the way this is expressed in human fathers and human mothers, but still this emotional sort of impact of fatherhood or motherhood is very deep in both. So we had, I think we had a presentation today on some of those hormonal aspects of parenting, and especially, so here we've been talking about the ultimate features, the fitness sort of constraints that the mother, for example, has to have high fitness infants, but not too much at the detriment of her own potential fitness in the future. And the same way for fathers whose fitness is increased by investing in their infants, but only to the extent that it's actually based on paternal certainty. So these are the ultimate fitness consideration. That's what we call an ultimate explanation for why we have all these behaviors and emotions, etc. Now, the proximate explanation is how it works in the actual sort of mechanism. If you look under the hood and see what is going on in the organism, what you find. So there's a whole sort of hormonal machinery that's triggered by parenting that deeply modifies motivations and behaviors, and by sort of changing brain processes through release, for example, oxytocin, mostly in human mothers, and it's testosterone decrease in fathers. Infants' faces are known to trigger sort of hormonal cascades that is sort of hormones that trigger other hormones and so on and so forth in the parents' bodies. And note that this is not always sort of positive stuff, in the sense that, as we said, there are costs to parenting. So you might imagine that under certain conditions, there are motivations to end parenting or limit it. And in fact, we find that there are lots of phenomena of that kind. So first of all, just in case you thought that parents, because they have more oxytocin, would be all nice people, it's not actually the case, because this oxytocin release, for example, in mothers, makes them not just extremely sort of concerned with their infants' welfare and ready to sacrifice lots of their own sort of welfare for the infant's welfare, but it also makes them extremely aggressive against strangers. And there's lots of studies showing that oxytocin release, for example, makes you more sort of pro-social towards your own group, but also more xenophobic towards other groups, which makes sense in a sense, because you're investing in your own mostly. But also, you know, sometimes you have motivations to limit parenting. There's neglect and infanticides and things like that. Now, these are not aberrations. You know, when you think of infanticide, you think that surely this is parenting, that parenting gone wrong. I mean, there's something deeply wrong about what's happening. But if you think about it in terms of evolutionary sort of ultimate considerations, in terms of fitness, you'll see that, well, there are conditions under which, for example, an infant, looking after an infant would be a bad investment, in the sense that it would divert resources from the others for a return in terms of fitness that is very uncertain. And that is why you'll find that in many societies around the world, in many tribal societies, before we get the benefits of modern medicine and all that, selective infanticide is pretty common, mostly by neglect, by not feeding, not protecting those infants. That show sort of signals of disease or malformation or things like that. Things that show that in the cold sort of calculus of fitness, any resources spent or invested in those children will not return any fitness. We've talked about examples with, you know, lions, males devouring, and so, no, not devouring maybe, but at least killing the cubs. We have examples of storks, for example. You know, there's big birds that have, you know, those nests, and usually only have, because of the ecological conditions, do not have enough resources for more than 2 or 3 chicks, and sometimes take one extra chick out of the nest and just throw them overboard. In some species, and including in storks, it's done by the siblings sometimes, who push each other out, and the weakest one is pushed out of the nest. So these are cases in which what seems to be an aberration is actually the fitness optimization in that system working to such to maximize the fitness of the parents. So when parenting costs are high, we see that there's potential neglect and abuse. Is it the case that that this can be observed even in modern behaviors? Well, yes, to a large degree. So, for example, we find that paternal certainty is a great worry among humans, among males, of course, because that's crucial to their fitness. And there are sort of funny aspects of that which come up from some psychological studies. Like, for example, a study that showed that when people around the infant, the newborn, and young infant comment on their looks, very often families from all sides and friends and all that comment on the resemblance between the baby and the father, much more than about their mothers, which seems to be a sort of form of, which is, you know, maybe to reassure the father, but it's not just that. What it means is that the similarity in features between the infant and their father is, of course, vastly more interesting than their resemblance with their mother, because their resemblance with their mother is a cue, a signal, a sign of something we already know. Whereas their similarity with their fathers is a cue to something we do not know and we cannot know for sure. So would you say that biological fatherhood is a predictor of good parenting? Well, no, what you could say is that to a certain degree, the absence of biological fatherhood or signals of biological fatherhood is maybe a cue that limits parenting, or in some extreme cases goes against parenting investment. So Daly and Wilson, who did lots of studies of crime and homicide and stuff like that, showed in studies that even if you control for all the usual sort of social factors that you can find in these kind of social phenomena, you find that the risk to an infant of being abused or beaten or neglected by their father is multiplied by 40 when you're dealing with a stepfather. So what it means is that, first of all, I must reassure you that the cases of infanticide are very rare. So even if you multiply them by 40, you still have very few people. And of course, the vast majority of adoptive parents know how to and are highly motivated to look after their children. But the thing is that if you look at them at the extreme cases, sort of the cases of homicide, neglect, etc., you find that there is a substantial difference that goes in the direction of fitness. That is that the very strong motivation for parenting, even in worse conditions, will of course be weaker if there is no paternal certainty, or if there's certainty of non-parental link. So adoption works. I mean, that's the main thing. But the fact that it works is all to the credit of the people who engage in it, because it means that they have, in order to motivate themselves, they have less of the sort of spontaneous motivation that others would have. So infanticide, if you think that it has to do with fitness for mothers and the relative to the infant fitness, you would predict that the mother's age and marital status would have an impact on that, in the sense that infanticide would be much more likely if a woman has a long reproductive horizon ahead of her. As I said, each pregnancy makes you slightly less likely to have pregnancies in the future, and imposes wear and tear on tissues that cannot be easily repaired. And the older you get, the less easy it is to repair. So you would expect that in this sort of cold calculus, infanticide is less of a loss when there's another 20 years of reproduction than if there is another 5 years of reproduction. And that would predict that infanticide would drop down dramatically with the age, with a mother's age, which is what Daly and Wilson found. You would also see that the child's age is hugely important. But notice in these two curves that you see that natural parents, when they kill children, and once again, infanticide is very rare, but when it happens, is much more happens much more in the first months of years of the child's life. That is when the child sort of sends clear signal that it's a viable infant, or not, and then it sort of goes down. So you might say, well, no, it's just because, to be totally cynical, it's just because babies are easier to kill. But that's not the case, because if you look at the second graph, you see the risk that a child will be killed by a non-relative as a function of age, and you see that that curve is not at all the same. So it means that it's not just that babies are easy to dispose of, it's just that there is, in this case, a signal at that point that you have not invested yet in that infant, and what is the probability that it's going to be high fitness, but if it's low, then infanticide motivations sort of occur. So you find that in lots of human societies, you find that there's selective infanticide of twins, especially of one twin. We know that there is this phenomenon called TTTT, that is twin-to-twin transfer, transfusion, which means that basically one twin is getting part of the blood and resources from the other twin. This results in one of the twins being noticeably weaker than the other, and very often having all sorts of pathologies, which are clearly visible from birth. And in societies where this happens, in places where this happens, and there's no modern medicine to take care of the weaker twin, there's often sort of ideas, mythological ideas about the fact that where one of those twins has been taken away by the spirits already, they don't want him to survive. So it makes sense to not feed them, or let them just wither away and die. That happens, and congenital sort of abnormalities, the deformities, are things that very often lead to selective infanticide in societies that do not have access to modern medicine. But even in places that do, you find that, for example, in the US, children who are sort of potential low fitness children, have spina bifida, sort of cleft palate, or even Down syndrome, on the whole, paradoxically, in many places, the parents visit medical institutions and doctors less for such kids than for the typically developmental kids. And also the rate of abuse is higher than for typical children. There are proximate aspects to these motivations, and for example, the crying. So the cries of infants are actually not just a brute signal that the infant needs attention and protection. They're also modulated by their state of health. And non-typically developing infants cry more, but also cry in a way that is slightly different. And that sometimes does not trigger motivations to have them from the parents. So as I said, people sometimes have all sorts of beliefs about the fact that the child is cursed or something like that, and all these provide a reason to do what you're motivated to do anyway, which is to not invest in that child. So this, being, so we'll leave this aside for a while, and we maybe have a presentation about this. And I want to tell you about something that's much broader, that has to do with parenting in the context of a whole sort of set of ideas that we've not talked about so far, only sort of in passing, which is life history theory, which has to do with the fact that organisms cannot constantly spend their resources on everything at all times, basically. And therefore they have to make choices, and those choices will take special configurations as time passes. So first of all, consider this consider the idea from this very simple sort of point, which is that there's always a quantity-quality trade-off in reproduction, in the sense that when you have energy requirements for reproduction. You must produce gametes, and there's mate acquisition, all the stuff we talked about. There's parental investment, and in lots of if you consider lots of different species, you try to understand the way the natural world functions across lots of species. You'll see where there are trade-offs between having lots of offspring of lesser quality because there's less that's been invested in making them high quality, or few offspring where you have fewer, which initially is less fitness enhancing, but lots of resources are spent to make them more fit. And in comparisons of species, sometimes people used to describe that in terms of what were called R strategies and K strategies, by the names of parameters in population genetics. The R strategy is one where there's a very large number of gametes and possibly large numbers of reproductive events, a higher investment, this arrow means higher investment in producing gametes and reproducing, and much less in postnatal investment. So you have a high number of offspring and low probability of survival for each of those. So these, I think it's cod row. So these are a cod, for example, among cod, the average sort of number of eggs goes into thousands or tens of thousands that are sort of spread all over the place, and sperm are distributed in the same way. And there's absolutely zero parental investment in the sense that once those sperm meet eggs, they, the organism is on its own in this. So it's an extreme in terms of putting all your investment, so to speak, in a huge number of low probability bets. Okay. And there's the K strategy. So look at those giraffes, for example, where the organism only has a few, so lower number of gametes to start with. Like many mammals, the female has a very low number of eggs compared with those fish, like cod. Very low number of eggs that are much bigger. So you have less of an investment in producing gametes and reproducing reproductive events, but you have a higher investment in postnatal behaviors that enhance the survival and fitness of your offspring. So you have a low number of offspring that have a higher probability of survival. This is called R and K. But the thing is that this is only one aspect of life history, and in fact, you can make it much more general by saying, well, what are the strategies of organisms over their lifetime? And this is a sort of simplified diagram of life history. So the idea of life history, basically a central idea, is the idea of an energy budget. So over your lifetime, you will extract a certain amount of energy from the environments, and then it will be expanded in all sorts of ways to grow some tissues, to grow some structures, lungs, feet, whatever, heart, a cardiovascular system, a nervous system, a brain. Also survival in the sense of running when prey try to get you, or hiding, or building nests and building shelters or whatever. Repair, which is, the whole sort of, for example, the immune sort of system that constantly fends off attacks from pathogens, but also repair of tissues, sort of, getting more and more cells to replace dead cells and so on. There's growth, of course, and growth is, just adding to the structure in the sense of making them bigger. So over the course of lifetime from birth to death, the central idea of life history theory is that your energy budget changes in the way those different posts are budgeted. So at the beginning, for example, let's take this as a sort of typical mammal. maybe human, maybe, well, yes, maybe this diagram is good for humans. So if in infancy and at juvenile age, what the organism does is grow and spend all its energy on growing and some of it on survival. But as you see, as they become mature, reproduction would become sort of a high budget sort of post, in the sense that organisms start spending lots of their energy in acquiring mate and reproducing, and maybe, for example, for mammals, gestation and so on and so forth. Survival is very important still. Growth is diminishing because the organism at that point is going out of its juvenile phase and not growing anymore. But tissue repair becomes, tissue repair becomes very important. Now, a bit later, you find that there's a lot of taking care of infants, so that's big. So this would be a mammal, and that's actually quite good for humans as a diagram. Reproduction takes less of that energy. Survival still takes the same, and tissue repair is important, but you see growth is completely gone, and reproduction is less because nurturing is more. So you spend more energy, like time, calories, etc., on nurturing infants. And then, and so this is appropriate for humans. Tissue repair becomes less efficient, and that's what's called aging, senescence. Survival's just another sort of post that has to be there, otherwise you wouldn't be around. But reproduction becomes minimal, and for example, in the case of human, females' reproduction becomes nil because there's menopause, which means that the investment in reproduction itself is gone, but there's much more investment in nurturing. So the basic idea of life history theory is that you can't do everything at the same time. So in order to fitness, to have higher fitness, you have to have a certain budget at different times of your lifetime, and that budget has to be differently balanced at those different points. So just look at difference between species, and you'll see that they have a different kind of life history budget. So rabbits, for example, have a typically what's called a fast life, life history strategy. They invest in lots of reproduction. They have lots of offspring. There's less investment in growth and repair. So those animals, a bit like squirrels, would be a bit like this too. They're animals that really do not live very long, and do not live very long past their offspring sort of maturation. And there's not much investment in nurturing. That is only a few weeks or months of looking after the offspring, and then that's it. But if you look at wolves, for example, you get a different sort of mammalian strategy, which people would call a slower life history strategy, in which there's delayed investment in reproduction. So females sort of wait a bit till they become really mature for reproduction. There's fewer offspring. There's more investment in growth and repair of tissue along the lifespan, and there's much more investment in nurturing. So these are species where infants are typically incompetent and vulnerable and must be protected. So as you see, just looking at this diagram, you would guess that humans are much more towards this slow life history than fast life history, in the sense that we have very few offspring. We spend enormous amounts of time and energy to nurture those offspring instead of having lots of different sort of babies, huge numbers of babies. So species typical strategies are on a continuum. There are species of mammals that can be more like these guys and others more like these guys. It all depends on what produces higher fitness over a long time, evolutionary time, in particular ecologies with particular morphology and so on. An important factor in understanding the energy budget is time discounting. You have to realize that, so time discounting is just the idea that the present value of future gains or losses is less than the present value of present gains or losses. So very simply, a perfect assurance to get $100 in 2 years is not worth $100. It's worth a bit less. Because $100 now, that's clear, but $100 in 2 years, you'll have to wait. So basically, that means that it's a bit less. In the same way, as we all know, and that's the phenomenon of procrastination, a loss in the future does not make you feel as bad as a loss that you have now. So having to write an essay for, you know, the 1st of December is something that becomes very annoying when you're 2 days away from the date. But if you are 2 months away from that date, you think it's not very important. So time discounting, like, you know, should you eat the cake just when it's out of the oven? Of course, it's great, but it doesn't taste quite as good as when it's cooled off. But at the same time, the nice taste that it will have in 1 hour somehow is not as enticing as the taste that's promised now. So the logic of time discounting is that future events should have less value now than they will have then. And there's a discount function that shows you that the rate at which you devalue the future. It's universal in nature. So these are two ways. There's an exponential and a hyperbolic way of considering this curve. In economics, sometimes people use the exponential more. And in biology, it seems that the hyperbolic fits the data a bit better. But anyway, that will not be on the exam. And it doesn't matter. What matters is the central idea, which is that time discounting is something that all organisms must do to maximize fitness, because the present impact of a future event, okay, so you will, you know, have to pay $200 in a year's time. The present impact of a future event is a function of that impact when they occur in the future, multiplied by the probability. And we know that from experimental and observational studies that most organisms discount, and discounts more steeply, that is, in a more exaggerated fashion than humans. They have a steeper discount curve. And the idea of discount is just that. So, for example, if you invest in offspring by, you know, nurturing them, then you will have a return on investment which consists in them having viable offspring. So that's a high fitness benefit. But that fitness benefit only occurs once they're grown, that is, in several years. So at the moment, when you're investing in their fitness, that fitness return should be multiplied by the probability that this will happen, which is a factor that's less than one, since it's a probability. And it means that if this factor is much less than 1, then this investment at the moment seems not to cover the cost that you're experiencing. So you should not invest in this very low probability discounted events. Now, the thing is that I was telling you about faster and slower strategy, and the faster one is the rabbit. That's easy to remember, because we remember the hare and the tortoise. And the slower one is animals like wolves or elephants. Elephants only have can only have offspring every 2 or 3 years maximum. They don't even do it that often. So there's a continuum between species, but as people have found, even within a species, you can have a continuum, and that is extremely important and interesting among humans. Among humans, you can find that there are some people who are more towards the slow strategy, and some are more towards the fast strategy. Of course, they're all humans, so it's within the parameters of the general sort of human existence. So of course, not, you cannot have 200 babies, for a human female. That's impossible. So there has to be, there are sort of natural limits to that variation, but there is variation. And why is that the case? Well, the general logic of this argument is that environments vary. Even in the same ecological niche, you can have environments that are more certain and more uncertain. You can live in a place where there happens to be a steady stream of resources, or environments that produce fewer resources, or in a very uncertain way. I'll give you an example. If you consider hunters-gatherers, foragers, think of some of them in places like the Kalahari Desert, like Kung Bushmen and people like that. They depend for a lot of their carries on hunting of large prey that is very, very uncertain, in the sense that it works sometimes. They're not very frequent. When it works, it's great. When it doesn't, it's the usual case. So they have uncertain resources. Think of hunters-gatherers, again, foragers on the northwest coast of America. That is the Washington State, British Columbia, and those places. You find lots of communities that were on rivers that were just teeming with salmon and bears, and so bears not very easy to catch, but once you catch them, you have lots of food, and salmon certainly is a high resource. And those environments were environments for those people of high certainty, in the sense that you can always count that there'll be salmon. It doesn't seem to vary much. So the idea is that because humans evolved in situations of changing environments, changing with seasons, but changing with over a certain sort of short time, humans have to have adaptations that allow them to detect whether an environment is secure or less secure, gives you more resources or fewer resources, with more variance or less variance. Those are the relevant cues that would, if you adjust your budget to that, lead to higher fitness. But of course, there's a cost to that, which is that you need sort of the importance of cognitive resources, to cognitive and hormonal, brain resources, etc., that are geared to understanding that process. So among humans, we know that environments vary even in typical, what we call sort of broadly understood EEA conditions. That is, you have environments with higher certainty of resources, some of lower certainty, some of higher danger, because some predators move in. So, big cats, for example, might be moving in some environments, and at some points, and then be rare, then be frequent again. And humans are very sensitive to these cues. So, for example, for nutrition, humans in all societies pay attention to the extent to which some resources are available reliably or not reliably, are regular, not regular, have a high average or a low average of return, and so on and so forth. So we know that humans vary in their life history theory profiles. So we know that humans, some of them are more sort of fast life, and I will explain what that means, and some are sort of more slow life. But do these budgets and these fitness considerations explain these variations between individuals? That's the question. Now, there are lots of domains in which people vary in sort of rate of development. So just like physiology, for example, and here I sort of just put the extremes of those poles, but as I said, again, those extremes are constrained by the fact that we're dealing with humans, so you can't go very far in either extreme, but you have this significant difference. So in physiology, there are individuals who grow faster, earlier, have puberty earlier, and biological aging strikes them earlier than others. Okay. In terms of mating, there are some people who have their sexual debut, that is, initiating sexual relationships earlier, have sexual partners, regular sexual partners, before, slightly earlier, slightly later. Also have relationships in terms of sex that are casual mostly, or that are more pair bonded. In terms of parenting, you have age of reproduction that could be earlier or later, the number of offspring, higher or lower, investment in offspring that can be lower in a fast strategy, like, as I said, you have more offspring but you invest less in each other, or higher because you have a lower number of offspring in the same way. I mean, it's just because you've got scarce resources. Reward orientation is a sort of psychological dimension in which, do people think of their lives basically as extending over a long time, or do they mostly think about what's going to happen next in a very short time horizon? And you see that some people are more on the fast, that is short life, and some people are more considering sort of long-term investment. And that, of course, seems to be something that you can express in terms of impulsivity. That is, do you do some tempting thing that will have bad consequences later, or do you sort of restrain from doing these things because you think of the future? So that's what I described as discounting. Are you a steep discounter in which you think that, well, it doesn't matter that something is going to have bad consequences in the future if I can get satisfaction from it now? Or are you a sort of shallow discounter, that is someone who thinks that the future matters a lot and thinks that, well, no, it's not a good idea to eat 20 sausages right now because I feel sick in the future, or get drunk because I'll be sick, or that kind of thing. Or it could be sort of long term, like I will do things that I will avoid things that will have bad consequences. Also, in terms of cooperation, so we haven't talked about cooperation yet, but we'll talk about it once after this. So the size of the moral circle, that just means, how many people are people with whom you have a trusting relationship, so that, they're going to help you, they have your back, so to speak. And you help them even if it's not really in your interest, but because you're committed to them. So how much of a circle of people like that do you have? Well, there are people on the fast life strategy who have a smaller circle of people, and some people have a larger circle. What qualities do you value in your partners? Is it dominance, that you want to be with a strong people, or is it trustworthiness? You want to be with people who you can trust. Your tendency to forgive, is it weaker or stronger? Now, one thing that you may have noticed is that I put all these things in this in this diagram, and I put all these values on each of these dimensions in the fast column, and all of these values in the slow column. So it seems that I was suggesting that there is a correlation between physiology, mating, parenting, reward, and cooperation, in the sense that if you are like this for mating, you're very likely to be like this for reward orientation, and for cooperation, and for physiology. That is what life history theory would predict, that all these things are intercorrelated. And that's the crucial point, is that as far as we know in terms of empirical studies, there is a lot of correlation. It's not perfect, but there's much more than you would expect if you were thinking that these things are just different bunches of variables that have nothing to do with each other. So all these domains show variations in humans. Between groups, between social class, and between individuals, you find variation in terms of reproductive sort of calendar, so to speak. If it starts early, if there's lots of people involved or not. Cooperation, but also the nutrition style. Engaging in violence, which is related to discounting, in the sense that with violence you can get stuff in the short term, but usually you get bad consequences in the long term. Parenting, in which you get all the costs initially and you get the benefits later, so that you have to have a long time orientation and shadow discounting in order to engage there. So you find individual differences in those things. But the crucial point is that those differences are correlated, and reproductive choices predict parenting. Parenting predicts violence and cooperation. Parenting preferences predict nutrition and cooperation, and so on and so forth. So we find that, again, looking at these diagrams, that, sorry, at this table, that there are things that you might have thought could vary independently from each other, like, the biological aging and your impulsivity, or the size of the circle of trusted partners you have, and the onset of puberty. But they seem to be correlated. So if you do vast studies with huge numbers of data points, and you run all the regressions, and you control for all the factors that should be controlled to avoid confounds, you still find these correlations, which means that it suggests that there is a difference of life history styles among humans, and that it affects all those things, but it stems from one crucial difference, which is the extent to which your life history is more towards privileging a short lifespan with expanding on as many things as possible, as early as possible, or if your lifestyle is geared to the expectation of a longer lifespan in which it makes sense, or it makes, it's more rewarding in the end, in terms of fitness, to engage in long-term preparation. So what cues could influence your life history theory? I mean, the thing is that it could be a perfectly sort of random variable. You could say, well, just that, like the number of hair on your head, it's mostly sort of, it's not terribly random, but it's inherited. Or you could say, well, no, it's something that actually depends on your environment. And what seems to be the case is that this general sort of orientation to lifestyle in terms of life history are partly inherited, like most things that are heritable, like, maybe it's 40 or 50% heritable, so that you are more of a slow life person, a fast life person, mostly because you had slow life parents or fast life persons. But also there is an influence of environments, and that's very important for if you want to understand all sorts of social phenomena. So among the things that people have noticed, that psychologists and sociologists have studied and have noted are relevant to this general life history orientation, fast life, slow life, there's parental investment received. First of all, how many parents? That is, do you have two parents, or do you have only one? The time invested, and the occurrence of violence and abuse. So the occurrence of violence and abuse predict a faster lifestyle, in the sense that people invest in getting rewards very quickly, even at the price of long-term bad consequences. But there's also information about the mating market. Excuse me. How many people are available in the mating market, so to speak, in the mating pool. But also information like, in your social environment, how many stable pairs are there, and how many isolated people. What's the age at which people marry? What's the frequency of marriage, if marriage is among the institutions of stable pairs? But also some information about the broader social environment. So, for example, status hierarchies in places that are more status-oriented, where there's strong hierarchies between people, there seems to be more of a style of having a fast life. Resource inequality. We know that inequality tends to trigger fast life strategies. The frequency of collective action. So that's simply the extent to which people around you engage in mutually beneficial interactions, like, doing stuff together or not doing stuff together. For example, there are some peasant societies where there's a form of what's called sort of selfish familialism, in the sense that every family does everything for themselves and never interact with others in economic sort of cooperation. For example, they just grow their own stuff, they go sell their own stuff, and that's it. There are peasant societies where almost everything is done collectively. So you build your barn with your neighbor's help, then you go harvest the fields with the neighbors and relatives, and they will harvest your fields, and they will build your barn, and so on and so forth. So that is a factor, the extent to which there's collective action around you. And there's something important which is called extrinsic mortality. That is, there's normal aging that leads to death, but there's also people simply getting killed by others or being predated upon by predators. And there's the age structure in the environment, that is in your social environment. What is the age structure? Are there any old people, for example? And what's the gender balance between those in those age profiles? So to take very simple cues, the idea is that if there are lots of old people in your social environments, that would send you a cue that investing in the long-term future is something that is possible and that might make sense. I mean, not that it's a conscious computation at all. The idea is that it would give you a cue that triggers a particular kind of motivation. And gender imbalance, I will talk about some aspects of that at some point a bit later. So if you see, how much you see a correlation, for example, between homicide rate and life expectancy, you see that, with a higher life expectancy, you have lower occurrence of murders, which simply means, and again, of course, they've removed the obvious, confirmed that people would be dead, therefore there'd be less homicides. So the idea is that in a place where there are lots of older people, people tend to kill less. But look at the Gini coefficient, which is a coefficient of economic inequality. And this is a very rough, sort of very gross kind of level, but there seems to be a very clear correlation in the United States between the inequality going up and the number of homicides. Okay, so that is some sort of social cue, it seems, that if there's high inequality, investing in the future is less of a plausible proposition, and therefore doing stuff like impulsive behaviors, like killing the people who stand in your way because you want to achieve something, is more of a viable strategy. You can find sometimes slow and fast strategies in the same place. So it's not a question of just states or nations or cultures. And there's a very nice set of studies by Dan Nuttall, who's an evolutionary psychologist who works in Newcastle in England. Newcastle has very poor people and it has very posh neighborhoods with great differences in educational level, income, marriage frequency, all sorts of variables. And you can use all sorts of experimental measures to see the extent to which people invest in others, in trustworthiness, in cooperation, and so on and so forth. So, for example, you can run dictator games. So dictator games, as we explained, are games, I mean, the simplest thing in the world is that I'm the experimenter, I give you, say, $10, and I tell you, now you can give those any fraction of those $10 to another person, another student who's doing an experiment, but you will not see them, you don't know them, you'll never get to know who it was. So you can give them all of your $10, you can give them zero, or you can give them whatever you want. And so the idea is that by this measure, we see to what extent you're so expecting of, you're so used to cooperation that you think, well, me getting $10 for no good reason, I might as well spread it on people. So you can spread it a lot by giving away everything, or a little bit, or not at all. Or, you can do funny sort of natural experiments like lost letters. So you just sort of leave envelopes that are addressed, that have right address and the right stamp, and you just throw them on the pavement, sorry, on the sidewalk, as people say here. That's a British term. It's a sidewalk. And when you see a letter like that, it has the postage stamp, so it's totally, I mean, it's almost free for you to go to a mailbox and put it in a mailbox. That's it, so that it gets to the person who was supposed to receive it. That's a kind of altruistic gesture in the sense that, yes, it will take you, 2 minutes of your time or 5 minutes of your time, but it's not very expensive. So the idea is just to lose lots of those letters in lots of places and see how many are actually mailed. And you can have observational measures like the levels of littering in neighborhoods, the petty crime, etc., etc. When you run those studies, you see that there are lots of differences between neighborhoods in the same city, and that basically the class differences that correlate with certainty of environments. Upper class environments are much more certain in the sense that there will be money tomorrow, there will be food tomorrow, or in 2 months or in 2 years. Whereas in poorer neighborhoods, there's a great deal of uncertainty about food, about resources, and even about survival. You find that you have the predictable effects that occur in terms, for example, of generosity. So here you have the neighborhoods A and B. So A is the posher one and B is the very low class one. And so the idea is that out of £10 that we give you, how much do you give to an unknown participant? Okay, well, those people give £5, the others basically give 0. To a friend of yours that you can nominate. You see, even there, it's very, very low compared to the richer neighborhoods where people give money. I must say the amounts of money are adjusted to people's income, so that it's £10 here, but it would be like £100 for the richer people, so that the marginal value is more or less the same. And then for charity, help save the children or whatever, or animal shelter or stuff like that. Poor people are a bit more generous, but even so, they're much less than people in those posh neighborhoods. So the idea being that if you live in an environment of uncertain resources, it's a very strange idea to spend resources you just got, like this £10, to a prospect that's good for the good of society in general, and that would return to you in some way or other because you live in a better society. The idea is that if your horizon is pretty short, it's much better to keep whatever you can. Okay, and that would explain these reactions. But also in terms of crimes, littering, police intervention, and group size and stuff like that, you'll find that there are those very strong differences. Now, as I said, this is sort of, here we're just looking at the results. It would be interesting to have domains where we can say, well, we have this life history difference, short and fast, and we can pinpoint to actual factors in development that made some people more or less prone to the fast, slow, or slow strategy. And that's the case for early pregnancy, teen pregnancy. And teen pregnancy in general, I think we had a presentation about that, so many of the background facts. It's always described by many social scientists as a problem or a difficulty or something to work against. It's to defeat teen pregnancy and all that. Before we get into this, this is just an aside. You have to realize that very often these things, like having your first child when you're 16 or 15, this is judged automatically as a bad kind of behavior, as something that would not be rational, that is not in your self-interest if you're a young woman at that age. We must sort of be careful about those, to rush to judgment, because often we take it as read that everyone has the opportunities and the sort of certainty about the future that we middle-class social scientists usually have. So, for example, if you look at this sort of common idea that, well, if you're pregnant when you're 15, it's very difficult to carry on going to school. Well, that's for sure. However, you have to realize that there are social environments in which going to school for another 2 or 3 years would not change much to your future on average. So sadly, the loss is not exactly as great as a middle-class person would spontaneously think. So the social world of other people may be different from ours. So is teen pregnancy a matter of impulsive choice? Well, in a way, yes, but it's something more interesting than that. And people who've studied these things have shown that, early sexual behavior, well, you might think, yes, sex is always tempting, or having babies maybe is tempting. Some people thought that it stemmed from contraceptive failure, so that people had the wrong information. But actually, all those efforts to give people better information fail, because that's not the problem. So there's an alternative hypothesis, which is that young women are sensitive to what the mating environment or the network of possible mates is like. And consider this: if you have a social environment in which there are fewer males than females around, especially there are very few males of parenting age, I would say, between 18 and 40. There's very low parental investment because there are very low numbers of fathers around. But anyway, the fathers that are around do not tend to stick with the mother of their children, and they desert them. So if you observe that, then there are lots of consequences. And the fact that there are fewer males around might be because of extrinsic mortality or extrinsic effects of a very special kind. If you are in a social environment in which, say, a third of men between 18 and 30 are in jail, or are in trouble with the police in some way or other, or are likely to be killed by other men, then the absence of men overall sends a very strong signal that is very visible. Okay, that is very salient in the social environment. So the idea is that maybe, to the extent that you have these features of the social environment, that would give a young woman or a developing young girl a certain cue that a cognitive system is expecting about the nature of the mating market around her. It would tell her basically that in this particular environment, males are not that many around. They do not invest in their offspring. You must not expect investment, either because the males are just dead or because they're not investing. So at that point, early reproduction is a better strategy in terms of fitness. Because why? Well, because earlier you can attract more males than later. I mean, if you wait until you're 25 to think about reproduction, you're 10 years older than the competitors, so to speak. So earlier reproduction might be a better strategy. Also, when you're younger, you have more of a network around you that can support you in terms of pregnancy, in times of pregnancy. So it would seem that rather than do what the slow strategy would tell you, which is try to find a good partner that will stay with you for a long time, etc. Given the likelihood that that's will happen, which is pretty low, it's a better strategy in terms of pure fitness considerations to have earlier pregnancy. So is there relevant evidence? Well, we had a presentation that gives us some data about that, so I will not sort of label this, but this is a slide that shows that divorce or separation between birth and age 10 predict early menarche, that is earlier first period, also first sexual intercourse, first pregnancy, shorter duration of first marriage, number of sex partners, and shorter duration of first marriage, which I already said. Um, so the mother's romantic partner in these cases is not like the father. So you have these cases, but we had effects of that. Ellis and Ronnie and all those people have documented the fact that the absence of a biological father has this consequence of accelerating development towards earlier puberty, earlier menarche, first period, and then earlier sexual activity. Now, if you think about it, this is an interesting, very fascinating and counterintuitive set of findings. Because what it shows is that there is a sort of evolved template that is in the brain of in the minds of the developing individuals that says that there is a certain way of managing reproduction and parenting. That's good, but that's okay. But you also have a learning system that focuses on what is going on in my social environment. What is the local mating environment like? What the ecological factors of parenting. And there's a sensitivity to specific cues. So when you look at an 8-year-old girl, there is a part of our mind that is assessing how many children around her are being looked after by a father or not, how many males are around compared to females, how many females are with a male for longer than several years, and so on and so forth. So this is a bit counterintuitive because we don't really know how the child's mind does that, but it seems to be the case that it does it. So the idea is that we have lots of unconscious reproductive strategies. We have strategies that say either so for example, go for many and very soon, and then you won't be around anymore, or go for fewer and be a high nurturer sort of parent. And these are affected by the environment, like fluctuation in sex liberation, so to speak. There are cultures of sexual liberation every sort of 30 or 40 years in Western societies, and they keep coming back in cycles. And hookup culture. That's something I will say a word about in a minute. But imagine that you're in lower class minority environments. When you have many men in jail or killed, there are few males around. The sex ratio distortion with few males and lots of females means that it's better for a fast strategy on the part of females. That is, the males have many more options than the females do. In other words, the females have to catch a male when they can, but the males would be more likely to desert females simply because there are lots of other females around who might be available. So there's a female advantage in early maturation using the early attractiveness that is, peaks at a younger age. So that's observed in lots of species, and that accounts for lots of variance. It also accounts for something that you might find interesting. So there used to be lots of interest in hookup cultures in various campuses. So at the moment, since no one's on campus or everyone is sort of fading away, there may be a bit less of that. But some people have done studies of the extent to which there is a hookup culture on campuses. So basically, a hookup culture is defined in those studies as the fact that the sort of cycles of courtship, sex, and stability are kind of are very different. So you have places where men have to court women in order to, get to talk with them and then get to have a coffee, which may lead to a date, which may lead to sex. And there are places where people start with sex, which may lead to actually liking this other person, which leads to maybe having coffee and maybe talking to each other and so on. So that's a bit caricatural, but every time I've talked to students about that, I see lots of people there. Okay, so especially women. So that style of hookup culture, as opposed to more sort of traditional courtship culture, let's say, is something that varies a lot. If you go to the U.S. Naval Academy, the courtship culture is at the extreme. If you go to Arizona State University, where one of those studies was done, the hookup culture is much more intense. Now, what would be the variable that would explain that? Okay, that's an exercise for you. And if you want, you can send me an email with your opinions about that. It has to do with numbers. I'll tell you, numbers of people. And remember that people come in two sexes. So I've given you enough cues so you can imagine what's the rest, in terms of the mating market, so to speak. And you have the explanation, and actually that is the variable. The one you should guess is the variable that explains those differences between campuses. Okay, so we'll have it, an easy quiz next time, and as I've already indicated, you'll have to send me all your questions by email because I can't be with you this week. So do that, and take good care to read the readings, because they will have a lot for this particular set of issues about parenting and life history.